Tales from the Crypt by Jack Oleck. Narrated by Chris Harvey. The catacombs had about them the smell of death, but it was a smell so faint, so ancient, that it had not really impinged itself upon the senses of the tour party. If they unconsciously dropped their voices to whispers, if, finally, they followed the guide in silence, it was not because of the smell, but because of what lay on all sides, buried in the rough stone walls of the torchlit passageways through which he led them. The passageways were eerie in themselves. Knowing that human skulls and dry bones filled the niches in the walls made them eerier still. The guide paused dramatically, his face shadowed in the flickering light of the torches. In the reign of Henry VIII of England, when the monasteries were dissolved and the occupants tortured, beheaded in public or secretly murdered, some went into hiding to worship as they wished. It is the decayed corpses and skeletons of these religious martyrs that you will see on your tour. These catacombs are dangerous, and I must warn you to stay close to me and not lose your way. The speech never failed to impress, and it did not fail now. The guide could almost see the delicious shivers that chased themselves up and down the spines of his charges. Satisfied, he led the way to a branching corridor, the visitors whispering to each other again as they followed. Not all of the visitors followed, however. Maitland had not noticed the upward slant of the stone floor beneath his feet. It caught his heel so that he stumbled and fell heavily, bruising a knee. It hurt, but he was already up, slapping the dust from his clothing and his hands when the people behind him hurried to his assistance. There were 4 of them, 3 men and a woman. "Are you hurt?" The man who spoke was middle-aged but erect and fit. Soldierly, Maitland thought. "No, I'm all right." Maitland finished slapping the dust from his hands. "We'd better get on after the others before—" His voice died. He had started to move forward when he halted suddenly. His voice was uncertain. Strange. Except for himself and his companions, the corridor was empty. His steps were hesitant when he again moved forward with the others close behind. A few paces farther on there was an open space, a widening in the corridor. Beyond the open space the corridor branched left and right. Save for their guttering torches, both branches were deserted. "But we only stopped for a minute. How could we have—" Maitland did not finish. He had never been a decisive man. It was like him to turn to the others. The soldierly-looking man answered Maitland's unfinished question. "Well, however they did it, they're gone. Which path do you think we should take?" Another of the men, a man of considerable taste and means judging from his appearance, pointed to the right-hand corridor. "Well, why not try that one?" No one for a moment seemed inclined to take the lead. It seemed natural finally that the soldierly-looking man should do so, but for a time the corridor into which he turned seemed no different from the one they had left. It was only when they had traversed a considerable distance that they came to a halt, and then not by choice. The corridor ended abruptly at what appeared to be a stone door. The soldierly-looking man pushed against it experimentally, easily at first, and then with all his strength. It did not budge. The man who had suggested that they turn to the right was apologetic. "Sorry, wrong guess." His smile was uneasy. "See here, since we seem to be companions in difficulty, why don't we introduce ourselves? My name is Ralph Jason." The soldierly-looking man glared at him as if about to berate him for his wrong choice, then apparently thought better of it. "I'm Rogers, William Rogers." The words were said grudgingly. Rogers, whatever his other attributes, was possessed only of small patience. He did not wait for the others to introduce themselves. He had already turned to retrace his steps. Before he could set off, however, the stone door began to open. The widened eyes of the others staring past him made him spin on his heel. Beyond the door there was a chamber hollowed out of the solid stone, a chamber lit by torches as the passageways were lit, but huge, with flat rocks scattered about here and there, and with something that looked like a large stone table set down at its far end. Behind the table stood what might have been a throne had it, too, not been made of slabs of uncut stone. If there was a way out of the chamber other than by the door which they had entered, it was not visible. Rogers, in front of the stone table, voiced the thoughts of all of them. "There's no way out of here. Let's go back." The others, until now concerned but not fearful, caught the note of urgency in his voice. They turned hurriedly and were too late. The stone door behind them was closing as silently as it had opened. They did not rush towards it. Instead, they whirled suddenly. Somewhere, someone had screamed. They had not seen the second door, the one in the corner of the huge chamber, but it was there. It had swung wide, and in the opening there was a man. A man who stood motionless, who wore the robes of a monk, whose face under his cowl was as lined and creased with age as the face of a mummy. Even as they stared, there was another scream. It came, they could tell now, from beyond the open door. The monk ignored it. His movements, when he walked to the throne-like chair and seated himself behind the table, were unhurried. Behind him, the door closed silently. Rogers was the first to find his voice, a puzzled, nervous voice. "Hey, what was that scream?" No answer. The monk's seamed face might have belonged to one of the corpses hidden in the walls. Only his eyes were alive, penetrating, incredibly lustrous eyes. "Who are you?" The woman, too, was nervous. Her voice trembled. The monk's eyes glowed brighter, but he still did not speak. "Where did you come from?" The trembling of the woman's voice had become a quaver. The glowing eyes surveyed them each in turn. "All in good time?" Maitland, even more frightened and uncertain than the others, took a step forward. "How do we get out of here?" "All in good time." The hollow, emotionless voice put ice into Maitland's veins, but he was able to fight down his fear. "Look, I'm in a hurry." "It can wait." Rogers had stiffened angrily. As fearful as the others, there yet seemed to be something within him that made him step in front of Maitland as if to take command. "Now you see here, I only stopped here because I had half an hour to kill and I saw the sign." "Is that why?" The glowing eyes widened, expanded, until it seemed to Rogers that he was drowning in them. "Sit down." There was a force of some kind emanating from his eyes. "All of you?" There was no denying the force. It reached out to strike them almost like a physical blow, impelling them. Slowly, reluctantly, they found seats on the flat rocks, and slowly the monk turned until he was staring directly at the woman. "Why did you come in here?" The woman's forehead wrinkled with concentration. Why? It was difficult to think, even to recall her own name. Clayton. That was it. Joanne Clayton. I don't know. I was driving past and something made me. "And what are your plans when you leave here?" "Plans?" The woman's eyes had locked onto the monk's. "Plans." The woman's eyes glazed, went blank, as if she were seeing something beyond the monk's eyes. Her head tilted at an angle, as though she were listening. Before he turned to his task, Clayton paused for a moment and cocked an ear toward the radio. He had always been partial to Silent Night. Christmas would not have been Christmas without it, and hearing it just now pleased him. He had been planning this Christmas Eve for the past month, and the music provided just the right finishing touch. Everything was perfect. There was even a crisp new blanket of snow outside, right on schedule. His eyes rested fondly on the Christmas tree with its glittering Star of Bethlehem and its festoons of tinsel and winking multicoloured light bulbs. How Carol had enjoyed decorating the tree with him, but then what 6-year-old did not delight in trimming the tree that would shelter her gifts on Christmas morning? He could remember his own childhood. Well, that had been long ago. Tonight was even better. Warmth filled his heart. He was a lucky man. Few men were fortunate enough to be blessed with a wife like Joanne and a daughter like Carol. He had a decent job, a comfortable home, everything a man could hope for. He was content, thanks to Joanne mostly. He didn't really merit so considerate and loving a woman. A flood of tenderness washed over him at the thought of her. From the table beside which he was standing, he took up the jewelled pendant that he had bought and so carefully hidden from Joanne weeks earlier. The pendant and its heavy gold chain had cost a good deal more than he could afford, but Joanne deserved the best. Pleased, he placed it in its leather case and took a small white card from his pocket. The card was blank except for the fancifully scrolled Merry Christmas at the top. He wrote his message very slowly below the lettering. His handwriting was awful and he wanted the message to be legible. "To my loving wife, from Richard." There. Before he closed the leather case, he adjusted the card and the pendant inside so that the card would not conceal the pendant's sparkle when Joanne first saw it. He was looking forward to that moment. Joanne would be delighted. She loved nice things. Carefully, so as to avoid wrinkles, he wrapped the case in silver Christmas paper and tied the paper in place with a strip of red and green ribbon. On the outside of the package he wrote, "For Joanne, from Richard," and then placed the package under the tree alongside the huge doll that was one of his gifts to Carol. The music from the radio swelled to a crescendo, and his sense of well-being swelled with it. It was good to be at home, to know that his daughter was safe and warm in her bed upstairs, and that Joanne was in the house. Smiling, he picked up the newspaper that lay on the table and settled himself in his easy chair. But he did not at once begin to read. His head cocked again toward the radio. "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." He was still smiling when the poker slammed down on his skull. He was still smiling when little geysers of blood and grey matter erupted on either side of the poker's length and his skull opened like a broken eggshell. And he was still smiling when he collapsed in on himself and slid limply to the carpeted floor and lay there looking up at Joanne out of surprised, sightless eyes. She stood just behind his chair, and she was smiling too. "Merry Christmas, Richard," she said. "Sleep well. Dream of Santa Claus." Her smile altered, became a little crooked. "I'll dream of all that nice insurance money, after they find your body at the foot of the cellar stairs, of course." With the poker she jabbed gingerly at the motionless corpse. But Richard was quite dead, and the poker she noticed was unexpectedly bloody. Not hurrying, she turned toward the kitchen. Calmness, of course, was of the essence. She had been telling herself that over and over again for months. Her plan of action had been painstakingly worked out, but all her care would be for nothing if she were to lose her head now and overlook some crucial detail. She was almost at the kitchen when she heard Carol's voice from upstairs. "Mummy? Mummy, aren't you going to tuck me in?" "I'll be right up, darling." She was proud of that, proud of the way her words came out, without a tremor. In the kitchen she tore paper toweling from the roll above the sink and wiped the poker clean. The poker she replaced in its rack by the living room fireplace. The paper was quickly consumed by the log fire that cast its cheery glow over Richard's crumpled body. That was done. Outside Carol's door she paused and took a deep breath before going in. Children were sometimes quite perceptive. It would not do for Carol to think that anything was wrong. She need not have been concerned, however. Carol was sitting up in bed, all pink and white and rosy with sleep, rubbing her eyes. Joanne gathered her into her arms. "What is it, dear? Having trouble finding the Sandman?" There were few things in life that she really cared about, but Carol was first on her list. A child deserved more than a seedy little house in the suburbs, more than a father who was content to be a mediocrity. For that matter, so did she herself. The chances she had to marry other men. Carol's slight arms went around her, and the rosy face was pillowed against her bosom. "Did Santa Claus come yet?" "No, dear, not yet. It's still early, so you had better go back to sleep. You know what they say, Santa doesn't like little girls who stay up past their bedtime." "Yes, Mummy." Carol had always been an obedient child. She slid down under the quilt. "Tuck me in, Mummy." "Of course." Gently Joanne arranged the covers, but the drowsy eyes did not close. "Can I see him when he comes?" "We'll see, dear." Joanne was becoming impatient. There was a great deal that still needed doing. "Now, you be a good girl and go right to sleep, or Santa may not come at all. All right?" "All right, Mummy." The words were interrupted by a yawn. "Night." At last. Joanne took another of her deep, calming breaths. Now. In the living room again, she took a cigarette from a box, struck a match to it, and then stood looking down at Richard. Deliberately, she moved her eyes away and let them play over the room. When her gaze settled on the Christmas tree, she noticed the new package at once. It had not been there earlier. She picked it up idly, glanced at the writing scrawled on it. "For Joanne, from Richard." Her voice became ironic. Fool. The package made a small thunking sound when she tossed it back under the tree. It was then that she became aware of the stain that was spreading like a halo beneath Richard's broken skull. She had once read somewhere that a man does not bleed after he is dead. She had, in fact, counted on it, but she had been misled. Damn! The newspaper was still clutched in Richard's hand. When she had pried it from his fingers, she lifted his head and placed the newspaper underneath to soak up the blood. At least, she noted grimly, the bleeding had stopped. The rest of what she had to do would be even more unpleasant, but it had to be done. Stooping, she grasped the corpse by the armpits and began to drag it toward the hallway and the cellar door. Only half her mind heard the radio. The music had given way to the local news, and the announcer was mouthing something about some minor politician. The words did not register. Her effort was too agonizing, too concentrated. Richard had been big, heavy. "And a man described as a homicidal maniac has escaped from the Middleton Hospital for the criminally insane." Middleton? Middleton? Why, that was almost next door, not 10 miles from Burley. The corpse's arms flopped crazily when she dropped it. "He is described as being 6 feet 3 inches tall, 210 pounds, dark eyes, long black hair, and he may be wearing a Santa costume stolen from a shop in Burley." Burley? He was here, then? Joanne shuddered. "All residents of the county are warned to be on the lookout for this man." Here? And she was alone in the house, with Carol to think of. She forced herself to think logically. Even if the man was really in Burley, the chances of his appearing at any particular house in the town were slim. Still, there was no harm in being careful. She smiled. She had time. Richard would not go away. Moving without haste, she went to the front door and turned the key in the lock. The radio announcer's voice followed her. "We continue our Christmas Eve program with a reading by James Mason of the famous Christian poem by Clement Moore, A Visit from St. Nicholas." Another voice, richer, deeper, filled the living room. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house." She listened for a moment. She had always admired James Mason. Now there was a man a woman could look up to. But there would be plenty of time to think about such things. Later, after all this was over. Who could say? She might even marry again. Carol would need a father. A father to replace the one who lay so still on the living room floor. Richard's eyes, still open, stared up at her. When she bent to place her hands under his arms again, those eyes were looking directly into hers. Her lips shook a little as she reached down and closed the lids over them with a finger, but she managed it. Moving him, however, was another matter. She was panting, gasping for breath before she had managed to drag him halfway across the living room. For all her effort, she could move him only an inch at a time, and for once she cursed herself for being a woman. Despite her resolve to be calm, she was near to tears by the time she reached the hallway, and froze. Someone was rapping at the front door, and if that someone was to enter the house now... The colour drained from her face. Thank God that she had had reason to lock the door. If she was very still, if hopefully Carol did not waken, then whoever it was at the door would wait a little while and then leave. Please, oh please, let whoever it is go away. She was not aware that she spoke the words aloud, or that the fear had constricted the cords in her throat, so that they came out in a hoarse whisper. But the rapping at the door persisted. A neighbour? No, the neighbours would be celebrating their own Christmas Eves. A friend? But she and Richard had invited no one. She had been very careful about that. Then who? Slowly, walking with careful delicacy to avoid making a sound, she crossed the room to a curtain-covered window. The window faced the street, and through it, if one craned one's neck, one could see the 3 white steps that led up to the tiny landing and the front door of the house. At first she did not really comprehend what she saw. There was a man at the door, a big man wearing boots and a Santa Claus costume, a man in a false beard better than 6 feet tall, with dark eyes and long black hair that straggled out from under a frowsy white wig and a tasselled Santa Claus cap. A man whose face under the overhead entrance light was shadowed, but not so deeply that she could not see the spittle drooling from one corner of his thick-lipped mouth. A man whose big hands opened and closed spasmodically. Even as she watched, the man seized the doorknob and rattled it violently. Its failure to open the door seemed to infuriate him. His spittled lips gaped so that the foam ran down and lost itself in the false beard. It was the foam, like the foam that flecks the jaws of a mad dog, that finally penetrated her consciousness. Oh no! She shrank away from the window. He mustn't see her. There was no telling what he might do if he caught a glimpse of her. Calm. Be calm. It was almost a prayer. But calm? In the face of that? The man was a maniac, a homicidal psychopath, and Carol was asleep upstairs, asleep and helpless. The panic rose in her throat like vomit. It was pure instinct that drove her to the front hall, that set her shoulder against the door, that offered her own body as a prop lest the maniac outside smash his way through. Go away! Dear God, go away! The words burst from her despite her effort to bite them back. Now he knew that there was someone inside, but there was no reply from beyond the door. Only a silence and then a renewed rattling of the knob, so violent that the key in the lock was jarred loose to fall soundlessly on the carpeted floor at her feet. Why she picked it up she could not have said. It was a kind of small release, an action, something, anything to relieve the tension that had in a few moments built in her until it was like a coiled spring needing only a trigger to snap it open and tear her own sanity to shreds. The police! Clutching the key, she ran back the way she had come. There was a telephone in the living room. If only there was time. The madman was pounding on the door now. The dull thuds echoed through the house like the muted booming of distant cannon. Dial! She had to dial, quickly! The key tinkled on the table as she dropped it by the telephone. Her fingers were stiff. They would not function properly. When she extended a finger, it found the wrong opening in the dial. No! This was madness. She could not call the police. Her eyes, roaming the room frantically, had come to rest on the open double doors that led into the hallway. Just beyond them Richard lay as she had left him, his arms akimbo, one leg sprawled out away from his body, the other bent under him with the dark congealing mass of blood and shattered brain that was the top of his head pointing directly at her. Somehow she fought down the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She would have to hide the body, then she could call the police. She needed time. Time. There was the strength of hysteria in her when she returned to the corpse. She lifted it almost easily and then dropped it again. Outside, beyond the living room window, there was a noise, a crunching. The sound was sharp, clear, so clear that it was a moment before she realized that it did indeed come from beyond the window and that the slamming at the front door, the rattling of the knob had ceased. Agonizingly, dreading what she would see, she turned her head until she was looking directly at the window. And it was like looking at a framed painting. The window sash made the frame. The painting was a dark face under a crazy jumble of white and black hair topped by a tasseled red cap. The painting was black eyes that gleamed with madness, that had points of fire buried deep within them. The painting was a slobbering, thick-lipped mouth that dripped froth. Then the face was gone. In its place was the sound of crunching footsteps in the fresh snow outside, footsteps that moved along the wall toward the back of the house. The kitchen door! Sobbing, she ran. The kitchen door was closed, but its chain hung loose, its latch was open. It was not an hour since she had gone out that way to drop an armload of trash into one of the refuse cans that stood in the backyard. Incredibly, she reached the door first and breathed the silent prayer of thankfulness that this key too was in its lock. The door had no deadbolt. She could not have locked it without the key. She turned the key frantically, hooked the safety chain into its holder, and the doorknob turned. He was there! She almost imagined that she could hear him breathing. She was sobbing aloud now, trembling as she backed away from the door. But the door held. There was no other way the maniac could get in, unless the kitchen window. It too was closed but not locked, and the footsteps were already moving toward it. Her movements were jerky with haste when she ran to it and shot the bolt, when she rushed to the living room windows and did the same, and then fled from room to room, locking window after window. Her lungs were bursting before she had done, and satisfied at last, stood again in the living room. She had almost forgotten Richard by then. but the sight of him snapped her back to reality. Calm. Be calm. That was the important thing. One final deep breath and she was able to master her thoughts. Now, if she could tumble the body down the cellar stairs, she could call the police. They would not go near the cellar. Their interest would be in the maniac. She had to do it. She had to. For Carol's sake. She held out a hand, stared at it. Better. Much better. The hand was hardly trembling at all. Satisfied, she started towards the corpse, but she had misjudged her own self-control. Her gait was puppet-like, uncoordinated, so that as she hurried forward, her elbow brushed against a vase, and the vase fell and exploded into 1,000 pieces, showering her shoes with glass splinters. Glass. The windows were glass. Only glass. She had been a fool. The madman had only to shatter a window, and she and Carol would be at his mercy. Her self-imposed calm twisted, bent, but she would not let it break. She had come too far. Her plans were too near completion. There had to be a way. There was. If only the maniac would give her time. She almost fell in her race down the cellar steps. She did not switch on a light. To do so might have alerted the drooling idiot outside to her whereabouts. But she needed no light. She and Richard had lived in this house for 7 years. She knew exactly where to look, where to find the boards he had only recently bought, boards that had been intended for a bookshelf in the den. Clutching as many as she could carry, she stumbled back up the stairs to the kitchen. Richard's toolkit was in one of the cupboards, a metal case from which he took a hammer and a handful of nails. Nailing the boards across the windows was difficult. She was not accustomed to tools. But again she managed. 3 times she ran back to the cellar for more boards in a frenzy of haste that coated her body with cold sweat. Dark blotches of perspiration showed on her clothing when she had done at last, and she could stop and lean weakly against the wall by the last boarded-up window. There was no way into the house now. She and Carol were safe. There would be time to hide Richard's corpse, time to call the police. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. His eyes how they twinkled, his dimples how merry. A strangled giggle bubbled from her lips. Through all that had happened she had been aware, in some dim, distracted way, of the rich voice that emanated from the radio. But now, hearing the words, she could not control the rasping, near hysterical laughter that rose in her. Her Santa had eyes like death. He was death. Nothing to dread, indeed. That was funny. Damnably, insanely funny. No, this wasn't the way. In a moment she would break, go all to pieces. She had to get a hold of herself. She could still win out, but only if she fought down this wild desire to laugh, to crow, the way the maniac outside would probably crow over her and Carol if he managed to get to them. The thought congealed her. She could no longer hear him, but he was still there. She could sense it. He was lurking outside, circling the house like a hungry, hunting animal. He was hungry to rend, to tear, to kill, and he would not be merciful as she had been with Richard. He would not end everything with a single stunning blow. He was mad. He would use his hands. She took a step toward Richard, purposefully, another, and another. Richard's face was no longer grey. It had taken on a kind of greenish pallor. She marvelled at that. She had not known that a corpse took on the colour of death so quickly. Despite all that had happened, it had really only been minutes since she had slammed the poker down on Richard's skull. One final heave, one back-breaking pull and shove, and it was accomplished. Richard rolled down the cellar stairs like a rag doll, his arms and legs banging against the railing as his limp length spun and bounced heavily. When he came to rest at last, his head hung at an impossible angle. His neck had been broken. She could see that much even in the dim light that spilled down the cellar steps from the hall where she stood. She nodded with satisfaction. She had not planned it, but the broken neck would make things a good deal simpler when she finally did tell the police that there had been an accident. But for the moment, that would have to wait. What she had started had to be finished. The panic was still in her, but it was held in check now. She could function. A few more minutes. That was all she needed. A few minutes and there would be no trace of what had taken place here tonight, no sign of violence. Then she could call the police, and when the maniac had been taken away... But later. The blood-stained newspaper still lay on the rug where she had placed it under Richard's head. It took only a moment to crumple it and toss it into the fire, but the stain on the carpet remained. That would never do. In the kitchen, she dumped detergent into a bucket and then filled the bucket with water. Carrying the bucket and some rags, she returned to the stain and began to scrub. Squatting, she rubbed and rubbed, but the stain yielded only slightly. In the end, she had to get down on her hands and knees, and still the stain persisted. A whimper escaped her. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that so small a thing should require so much time. She had no time. The terror began to return. She was whimpering in earnest by the time the stain dissolved at last into a pinkish blot and then slowly, oh so slowly, vanished. But it did vanish. That was when she looked up and saw the light above at the head of the hall stairs where Carol's bedroom was. The light was coming from Carol's room. The door was open. Joanne's jaw went slack. Her fingers, suddenly weak, dropped the rag she still held. All of the terror was back, choking her when she ran up the stairs to Carol's room. "Carol!" A voice hung in the air. The room was empty. "Carol!" Her rush carried her out of the room to the head of the stairs. Her stumbling feet found the topmost step and paused there, because from here she could see down into the living room. She could see the telephone on its table, the telephone beside which she had dropped the key to the front door. The key was gone. Slowly, timidly, each step a razor edge of uncertainty, she descended the stairs. Once she found her tongue, but when she said, "Carol," it was inaudibly, as if she did not really want to hear an answer, as though she feared what that answer might be. She was almost at the foot of the stairs now, at the living room door, at the door that led into the front hall. "Carol!" The constriction in her throat had eased just a little. She was able to speak in a dry, croaking quiver. "Carol! Here I am, Mummy!" There was a lightness in Carol's voice, gaiety, all the happiness that is the very special province of children on Christmas Eve. She came running as Joanne stepped into the hall, smiling aglow with wonder and delight. But Joanne had no eyes for the happy, beaming little face. She stood just inside the hallway, staring. Carol took her hand and squeezed it impulsively. "It's Santa Claus, Mummy!" There was a pounding in Joanne's head. Her eyes had widened and there was a sick certainty in them. "I let him in. Aren't you glad, Mummy?" Carol said, and went to stand beside Santa Claus, blissfully oblivious to the fact that his beard was askew and flecked with froth, that his huge hands opened and closed spasmodically. Joanne managed to scream once, just once, before those hands closed about her throat and dirty thumbs clamped down on her windpipe. The last thing of which she was aware was the radio. "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Joanne came out of her trance slowly. The monk's eyes were still fixed on hers. She spoke automatically, without thinking. "Nonsense! I have no intention of—" "Haven't you?" The monk did not wait for a reply. He seemed to have forgotten her. His basilisk stare was on Maitland. "And you? You said that you were in a hurry. Why were you in such a hurry?" "I'm on my way home to my wife and children." It was difficult for Maitland to mouth the words. "And then?" The monk's hollow voice had changed, become almost a caress. It made Maitland shudder. It was as though the cowled and hooded figure behind the stone table could read his mind. "And then?" The monk's eyes caught Maitland's, held them. Maitland could see nothing, think of nothing but those eyes. Then they receded, vanished, and he remembered. Joanne Clayton's fateful story, and All Through the House, was written by Jack Oleck and narrated and sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Stay tuned. Coming soon, I will be bringing you more Tales from the Crypt with Carl Maitland's fateful story, Reflection of Death.